Joining me now is Shahira Jalil Al-Basit, and it's an amazing story and a tragic one that turns into one of hope. So I want to get to it right away. Shahira, how are you?
I'm good, Cheng. Thank you so much for having me.
No problem. Well, let's talk about the tragic part first. Your cousin Sabika Sheikh was killed in the Santa Fe, Texas school shooting. Now we've had so many massacres that it's hard to keep up with them, but that was one of the more notable ones that happened in 2018. So first of all, tell us a little bit about that and then what that got you to do in response.
So thank you so much for having me. Essentially, Sabika, like myself, she was an exchange student from Pakistan, the US, and I think that makes her story kind of like the way our family feels all the more disenfranchised when it comes to having a disenfranchised grief, because we are a Pakistani family. We sent her to the US as a guest. She came to the US in 2017, almost completed her exchange year, her 9-month period in the US. She was placed in Santa Fe High School in Texas. And guess what? She was just 3 weeks short, literally 18 days away from her return home to Pakistan, when on Friday, May 18th, the gunmen barged into her arts class in the morning, killed her, massacred her with 9 other people on May 18th last year, the Santa Fe High School shooting. And that absolutely changed everything for our family. I mean, I think that's an understatement, frankly, because it changed everything from the way we looked at the US gun violence epidemic to the way we looked at, or I personally looked at, her legacy of young people wanting to do more and what she could have done with her life.
Yeah, so look, I know there are some parts of northern Pakistan that still have Taliban and are dangerous, etc. But are people in other countries like Pakistan beginning to worry that if you send your kids to America, it's just too dangerous a place with all these weapons in this country?
I think, frankly, it's important to juxtapose how Sabika or any other young person, even in Pakistan, would have, experienced life as a young teenager. I think, given the fact that Pakistan has battled with terrorism is one thing, but we growing up, Sabika, myself, would never fear the fact that we would go to school and get shot because we have, a systemic gun violence epidemic. That's never a thought we get in the back of the head. But now, it's so unfortunate that, when you talk about the US gun violence, you talk about what perceived to be an anomalies like Columbine, like even Sandy Hook. You would think that wouldn't be the norm, but turns out that is now literally an everyday occurrence. It's not just high schools, it's not just mass shootings. It's literally, I'm a grad student, I'm an exchange student in Washington, D.C. And every other day you're hearing stories about drive-by shootings, shootings within the communities of color which are disproportionately impacted. So now, as a Pakistani exchange student studying in the US, I think I am in a special position to perhaps reflect on how people back home look at the US gun violence. And I think I can speak to the fact that, yes, it's now becoming very reflective of the lack of action on the part of US legislators. And we actively think about the fact that, guess what? US has a unique problem, which is the gun violence epidemic.
Yeah, look, I've talked to Europeans who are scared about coming to America because you're much more likely to suffer random violence and one that ends in a lethal confrontation in America than almost any other country. And so it's amazing what we've done to ruin this country in a sense. But now you're a Fulbright scholar, so you came up with an interesting, different idea to partly to address this problem, but overall many other problems, and that is about emphasizing the youth. And you've got a 30% youth quota campaign. That's very interesting. I want to talk to you about the details of that, but first, you have this amazing stat that I didn't know. What percentage of the world is under 30 years old? And what percentage of parliamentarians are under 30 years old across the country, across the world?
So thank you for asking that, because that essentially is what really hit it hard on me. I was like, is this for real? Because guess what? 51% of the world is currently under the age of 30. This, by the way, is the largest youth generation ever recorded in the history of the world. That says something. And you would think that would be reflected in how many people really constitute or compose the institutions of power. But turns out we don't even make 2%. It's so ridiculous, for the lack of a better word. We make 1.9%. So out of 45,000 members of the parliament in this world, only 1.9% of them are under the age of 30 or 35, depending on how you define youth, depending on the country-specific context. But we're not even 2% there.
I do know one that's gotten a bit of notoriety, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And so it turns out that if you have people who are under 30 in Congress, they might make a difference.
No, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, for a fact, I think part of the inspiration for me to really come up with the campaign was the fact that people like AOC made it to Congress. And I think that really was unprecedented for a lot of reasons. And that reflected the fact that, not just in the US, but like speaking from a strictly South Asian perspective, Indian, Pakistani perspective, I've been talking to people in the Middle East for this campaign. I've been reaching out to people in the African continent. And everywhere, the common thread is that young progressives, yes, young people, yes. But when these two subsets really collide, young progressives, and they make it to the institutions of power, they make it to the institutions of decision making and policy making, they can challenge the status quo in unprecedented ways. So that's what we saw, like you said, in the case of AOC.
Yep. So some parts of this campaign I don't think are controversial. So you say the minimum age to vote should be the minimum age to be in Congress. And in a lot of instances, it's not, including our own Congress. You could vote when you're 18 years old, but you have to be 25 to get into Congress and 35 to be president. So that's so logical. Between you and I don't think we need to discuss that much further, although there's a lot of work to do to get that to actually change in the laws of all those different countries. But let's get to the stuff that I'm sure will be considered controversial. You say that there should be a youth quota of 30% of candidates under 35 on elected or reserved seats for national, state, and local elections. So an actual quota, how would you, before we even get to how you would enforce that, most people will say quotas don't sound quite right. Why not just let the people decide? And if they like younger representatives, they'll elect younger representatives, and if not, they'll elect older representatives.
So here's the interesting thing about it. Currently, the research on quotas, you're absolutely correct with your concern about it, and people can be skeptical about it. And some part of it, I would give them that it's legitimate. Why is that? Because the research around quotas is absolutely absent. It's not there. There is very limited literature which really establishes the fact that they lack efficacy. So when the argument comes up that quotas do not work, we need to look at how many countries actually have instituted quotas and how many of those quotas are actually holistic. For instance, currently right now, 21 countries have some sort of quotas, but they're not holistic or all-encompassing in the sense that they eventually end up in tokenizing young people. For instance, I can think of the example of Uganda, which has 5 seats allocated, or 5 reserved seats for young people. I struggle to think how much would 5 seats really do in making sure that young people are represented. And then essentially, one of the critiques on quotas is, like you said, that they're not able to do enough, that they're perhaps not able to put enough progressives or put enough young people into office. But guess what? The whole hierarchy, and that essentially forms the motivation of this campaign, the entire hierarchy of how intra-political party democracy works, or the lack of it works, is that it essentially requires you to have a certain social capital. It essentially requires you to have a certain financial capital to be able to become visible to the incumbents, to become visible to those who hold power, the status quo, the establishments. And that is why one of the requirements, one of the agendas of this quota is to ensure proportional representation to historically marginalized groups. Because coming from the background that I do, I've seen most visibly, not just in Pakistan, but to my own surprise in the US, that young people who come from communities which have been historically disenfranchised really lack the resources to become visible, for them to really, penetrate into the culture of political parties. That essentially means that they cannot pitch themselves as capable enough. They cannot pitch themselves as ready enough for the status quo to take them seriously. as a consequence of which, even if you have quotas, yes, they will be ineffective because they're not holistic in their design. They're not really responding to the fact that youth is a cross-cutting identity. It's not a monolith. And you cannot just go out and say that, we're just putting a number on how many people we need in office and that will do. No, it won't. That's essentially why this campaign is not revolving around 1 or 2 points. It's really making a 5-point agenda because it wants this youth quota to be responsive of the localized contextual needs of specific countries.
So, I mean, I think I agree with plank number 5 the most, because you're talking about imposing strict limits on corporate donations and electoral campaign spending, because that's what's, I mean, there's 2 elements to that. One, it protects the status quo because the corporations and the big donors like the status quo. They don't want it disturbed, so they give money to people who are already incumbents, who are already old. And the second part of it is the young are idealistic. That's not good for corporate donors. You don't want idealism. You want to crush that idealism and have people like Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, and Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump give you everything you want because they're jaded and they've lived and grew up in corruption. So I love plank number 5, but I want to ask you one last plank that I'm more unsure about, which is number 4. You're saying you should also ensure proportional representation of gender, racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic minorities within your youth quota. So how would Pakistan do that, for example? So I get it on the socioeconomic issues, I get it on gender issues. So would Pakistan have to ensure that more Hindus also get representation? How would that work?
So it's I think that's one point which I find very intersectional, not just in respect to how Pakistan would respond to it, but in the fact that how a variety of other countries would respond to it. We can take the example of India, where right now we just came out of one of the largest elections in the world, and what we saw is that there are a number of cross-cutting identities, like I mentioned. You have caste identities, unfortunately, which still prevail right now. You have Dalits who cannot really make a dent because they don't have the social capital politically. In Pakistan, for instance, we recently had the example of a Hindu, like you mentioned, Krishna Kumari, who won on the seat of the Senate in what was a historic win. Similarly, there would be multiple avenues, and I think the avenues kind of exist. And why is that? Because these political parties kind of like have the capital to work with the people and identify if they, like you said, if they come down to it. That's precisely the point of it. If the political parties can really get down to understand that there needs to be an institutionalization of getting more young people into office, that's their buy-in right there. And I think beyond that, once we get their buy-in, beyond that, I don't see a greater challenge of how would they kind of struggle with identifying these historically marginalized groups and getting them the ticket, the political ticket, the electoral ticket run for office. I don't see that much of a challenge. I think the greater challenge would be, like you said, would be to create a global momentum, a global conversation around the need to have more young people in office in an institutionalized way, which would get these incumbents, the status quo, to recognize the need for it and really come to the table and kind of like start the conversation on something like this.
All right, Youth Day is coming up on August 12th, 2019, obviously. So if you guys want to help by then, go to change.org/p/young, sign the petition, and obviously that'll strengthen the voice of the youth across the world. Shahira, thank you so much for joining us on the Young Turks. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Jay. Thank you so much.